So, hello, I'm Dave Wilhelm, president of GSM, the Geological Society of Minnesota. Welcome to our fourth lecture of the 2021 schedule. The lecture's topic this week is Geological and Tectonic Evolution of the Transantarctic Mountains from Ancient Craton to Recent Enigma by John Goodge at the University of Minnesota-Duluth. This is our second UMD lecture that we have an opportunity to get lecturers that aren't in town, as we were just talking a few minutes ago. I'll introduce John shortly, and thanks for being a tradition. It goes back 82 years to 1938. The format, as most of you know, is I'm going to do a few announcements, then John's 1 hour lecture, and then Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have cookie break this year. All participants other than the host, the presenter, and the moderators are muted. For most lectures, including this one, Randy Strobel is the host, and he and I are the moderators, and actually Steve is too, Steve Erickson. As always, thanks to Randy for setting up these Zoom webinars. The Zoom platform offers a number of means for interaction that we use. We like to handle most questions at the end. To enter a question, click the Q&A icon and type in your question. For those few persons who are joining by phone, we will unmute you at the end, assuming you don't forget, in case you have any questions, and you can just ask them verbally. And we might unmute other questioners if it makes sense, so they can clarify their questions. Otherwise, so if you have a quick question for which you'd like an immediate answer, click the raise hand icon and enter the question. For those, we will use our best judgment about interrupting the presenter during the presentation. You can also use raise hand to report any technical issue. And there's also a chat option that allows you to type a message for all participants to see, or actually only for the moderators to see, either way. Feel free to use that before the lecture, and I don't know if you have been or not, but use the all panelists and attendees option if you want everybody to see it. In a few minutes, I'll mention 3 other ways that we use chat. Most of these GSM webinars, including this one, are recorded and are available. We'll make available on YouTube. We'll send to members and the other participants an email with a link when each becomes available. This lecture should get available in 2 or 3 days, and then I'll send it out. And I'll send it out to John too, by the way. The full lecture schedule's on our website, gsmn.org, as always. And as always, thanks to Steve for arranging another outstanding slate of topics and presenters. 2 weeks from now, November 16th, will be on the biography titled Minnesota's Geologist, The Life of Newton Horace Winchell by Sue Leaf, the author who will be presenting that night. So we'll have a chance to learn about one of Minnesota's pioneers in geology. This webinar, as all GSM webinars, is copyrighted by the author. We kindly ask you to respect the copyright by not forwarding the Zoom link and not recording the lecture yourself. Thank you. As with all our live lectures, this lecture is free and open to the public, not just GSM members. If you're not a GSM member, and that means I probably corresponded with you by email in the last day or two, please open the chat box and type non-member and your city and state, province, or country, in case we have any people from other country. Also mention how you found us. We like to see how many non-members attend so we can see how well our information reaches the general public. Tonight there were at least 3 people that aren't members that asked for credentials, so hopefully we have at least that many listening right now. Also, we can count the number of devices that tune in, but not the number of people watching. So that we can get a more accurate count. What we'd like you to do, if you're watching with at least one other person, type 2 persons or whatever your number is in the chat box. And then I can add those to the count of the devices. So appreciate you doing that. People have been doing that in the last couple of weeks, and we appreciate that. Then continuing education credits. These lectures are eligible for 1 hour of that. I hadn't mentioned that before, actually, but somebody was asking about it this time around, so I thought, well, we should mention it. So if that's something you can use the chat function to request a form, include your name and email address. And if you don't want that everybody to see that information, there's a chat option that allows you to that allows only the host to see what you say, what you type. And then following the meeting, I will fill out a form, sign it, and email it to you. So if you're interested in continuing education credits, that's the way to do it in this new way of life under Zoom. And one more announcement, our next GSM board meeting is Thursday, November 12th, so a week and a half. All current and newly elected board members will receive invitations probably tomorrow, as others who frequently attend. But these board meetings are open to all GSM members. So if you'd like to observe and you haven't before, send me an email and I'll include you in the invitation. Any other announcements? I think you could use raise hand. I don't see anything, so hopefully there aren't any other announcements. So I'll get into introducing John. John Goodge is on the faculty of U of M Duluth. He's led 15 research expeditions to the ice, as he calls it, since 1985. His main research interests are in development of the Precambrian shield of East Antarctica and in tectonic development of the Ross Archean, which was active from 600 to 480 million years ago. Welcome, John. We look forward to hearing from you about the geology of Antarctica. And I will stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing yours.
Great. Let me do that. Pop over here. And okay, so 2 checks. I just want to check you guys are seeing a picture of some mountains and that you can hear me okay. Is the volume all right?
This is Dave, and okay on both counts. And I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to you, Dave, and also to Steve Erickson and Randy Strobel for the invitation to speak about the geology of Antarctica. It's really special to me, both personally and professionally, and I'm really glad to be able to do this tonight. I suggested when I was asked about giving a talk to talk about the Transantarctic Mountains, which, as you'll find, is a huge topic, both spatially and in terms of time. So we've got a lot to cover, and I'll try and just hit you some of the highlights. I'm not going to go over, everything, but I try and focus on a few things that I've particularly had an interest in over the years that I've been working there. So we're going to start out by looking at the tectonics of Antarctica. So this is a map showing you from a polar view, looking down on the continent of Antarctica. And Antarctica is a little bit unique all by itself, or just from a continental perspective, because it is in the middle, it's obviously in a polar position, but it's also in the middle of a single plate called the Antarctic Plate. And you can see that the plate itself is made up of the continental region. Hopefully you can see my mouse, is that right? Moving around? If I point to things or not?
Yeah, we can see it. Yep.
Okay, all right. I'll try not to do too much of that. But in any case, we have the continent of Antarctica, and then it's surrounded by oceans, and all of that is one tectonic plate, and the plate boundary goes all the way out to the red lines, which are oceanic ridges. And so mostly the continent sits smack in the middle of this large tectonic plate, and the Transantarctic Mountains, which you see crossing the middle of Antarctica, appropriately why they're called that, separate Antarctica into 2 pieces, the east and the west. On the east is the old Precambrian Craton, and on the west is largely made up of younger crust and a rift complex or a continental rift zone, and then flanked out on toward the Antarctic Peninsula here by younger volcanics and igneous belts. So this is an interesting mountain belt because it's in the middle of a continent, which is in the middle of a plate. A lot of times we think of mountain belts forming at the edges of plates or in collision zones, and that doesn't seem to be the case either in terms of a plate boundary or at a collision zone for the Transantarctic Mountains. So we call it an intraplate or within plate mountain belt, and as it sits right at this boundary between the east and west parts of Antarctica, then it has some curiosity to it in terms of how it may have formed. Now, I'm going to talk about some geography and scale issues on the next couple of slides. And before that, since I've got this slide up, I just want to tell you why we call this East Antarctica and West Antarctica. So you'll notice at the top of the slide is the 0 line of longitude here. So this is the prime meridian coming down from Greenwich in the UK. And so in this geographic context, this is considered to be the northern reference frame, and anything to the right is considered east, and anything to the left is considered west. And that is normally the way we handle things, except that when we're in the field, local north might be different, and so things get all turned around. But that's the convention for East and West Antarctica. This is a satellite image map of the continent of Antarctica, and you can imagine, it looks like here, it's mostly covered by ice and snow, and about 2% of the continent has exposed rocks coming through the ice and snow. And you can see that through the Transantarctic Mountains, which go right by the South Pole here, and also around some of the margin areas near the coastline, and in the Antarctic Peninsula, we can see geology exposed as well. It's a pretty big continent. If we superimpose the outline of the 48 lower states on here, you can see that it's a pretty big area that is covered. It's about the same size as Australia, one of our important continents. And if we were to, since this is a geological audience, if we were to superimpose the geology of the United States, or the lower 48 anyway on here, you can appreciate how complex the geology of the US is. Since we know that Antarctica is mostly covered by ice, we don't see most of the geology, but we could imagine that the geology of Antarctica is just about as complicated. So what we try to do is sort of a fool's errand, in that we're trying to understand the geology of a continent that we see very little of directly. And I'll allude to that as we go along tonight. This is a perspective view of Antarctica, I should back up one slide. That's kind of why I can't cut the US on here, but it's sort of looking from this direction down in the lower left, and looking across west part of West Antarctica, and at the face of the Transantarctic Mountains, and then up onto the polar ice cap of East Antarctica on the horizon that you see there. And this is an interesting perspective, because it really shows us how much of the continent is covered by ice. I put some red circles on the Transantarctic Mountains, the two areas where we actually know there's any Precambrian basement. So in Minnesota, where we have Precambrian all over the place, and we're used to it, but there's only a couple of places in this large mountain belt where we actually have any of the old Precambrian Craton exposed. And so if we want to delve into the ancient history of the geologic history of Antarctica, we have a problem when so much of it is covered by ice. Now, fortunately, the mountains do stick through that ice, so we can learn something about their formation as well. If we were to cleverly and instantaneously strip away the ice and snow, the surface of the land mass in Antarctica would look something like this. And I left a dotted line up on the horizon to show you what the position of the ice cap is. So there's upwards of 10 or 12, 13,000 feet of ice sitting on top of Antarctica today. We can see the Transantarctic Mountains there separating again the Precambrian Craton, the old shield, as it were, in the background from a continental rift zone, which is in the foreground in this perspective view. And so there are lots of questions that we want to answer, including the tectonic assembly history for the continent. We'd like to know what the crustal provinces are and boundaries that made up this amalgamation of rocks that we now think of as one continental plate, but it must be more complicated than that. And so we imagine that there are lots of little subdivisions. We'd like to know what the origin of the mountain belt is. And as I hope to show you tonight, the Transantarctic Mountains actually has a long-lived history through several phases of geologic evolution. And in particular, many of those stages are related to supercontinent cycles. And I'm sure you're familiar with Pangaea and Gondwana and maybe other supercontinents. We'll talk about the relationship between Antarctica and other continents in those supercontinent cycles. And then finally, because the Transantarctic Mountains are in this odd intraplate setting, we'd like to know something about the causes of the modern uplift that we see today. Okay, the image on the left is it's sort of a fixed up radar image of the surface, all the gray shades on there, and you can't see too many details in there because it covers such a large area. Now this map is turned around. If you look at the inset down in the lower left, it's basically flipped around 180 degrees relative to the first maps of Antarctica that I showed you. So if you were to fly north in this direction off of the map in the up direction here, you would eventually end up in New Zealand, okay? So the Transantarctic Mountains has a lot of different geologic elements to it, and we'll talk about some of those, which are shown in these color patterns on the map. But just in terms of its physiography, you can see a sort of a shaded relief here. You can see the mountain belt coming through in this zone in that region there. And just a couple of interesting geographic notes about this. It's over 3,000 kilometers long. It's over 4,500 meters in elevation, which in places is over 14,000 feet. So it rivals some of the Rocky Mountain peaks and areas that we're more familiar with. Again, it forms the tectonic boundary between East Antarctica, which now is on the west or on the left, and West Antarctica, which is to the right, okay? And interestingly, again, it separates the old Craton from a younger rift system, which is sort of bounded or bracketed by these orange lines that you see here. And so the mountains themselves represent not only a tectonic boundary, but a physiographic boundary and a meteorological boundary that governs a lot in terms of modern climate and atmospheric circulation and weather systems and so on. So people studying in the Transantarctic Mountains, whether geologists or biologists or just about anybody else, it provides a natural laboratory to look at extreme changes in tectonics, in elevation, latitude, ice thickness. Again, the ice cap is thick over on the right, or the left-hand side, and it's much thinner. In fact, this is a floating ice shelf called the Ross Ice Shelf right in here. And so there are many things that the mountain range does to divide the continent itself up. This is a probably overly complicated diagram, but it's basically showing a lot of different stages in the geologic development of the Transantarctic Mountains. There's an age scale at the bottom, which I want to point out a couple of things. One is MA here, you may be familiar with, stands for millions of years before present. So we just talk about this age in millions of years, meaning how many millions of years ago we're talking about. Notice that this is a log scale here, so it goes back an order of magnitude in time with every equal division. So that means that the younger history up here, the parts of the Antarctic history in the Transantarctic Mountains less than 100 million years are very expanded, and the early history, it goes back 3 billion years ago that I'm going to talk about shortly, is very compressed on this time scale. But I did this so that you can actually see the full span of geologic events in sort of a, without laying out a big long roll of paper to show you what that time span actually looks like. So I'm not going to go through the details here. There are different events. The legend shows you that there's glaciation, sedimentation, volcanism, and so on that are taking place. So it's geologically quite varied. I'm going to focus on two time periods shown by the red circles. One back in the sort of middle Precambrian during the Archean and into the Paleoproterozoic time periods when a lot of the crust of East Antarctica is forming. And then I'm also going to talk about this period in here in the very late part of the Proterozoic and into the early Paleozoic, the Cambrian Ordovician in particular, to talk about the Ross orogeny, or an early mountain building stage that we see in this mountain belt. And then I'm going to also make reference to several of the supercontinents that were in existence around the world at these different times. So there's a continent called Columbia, which, and for the rest of my talk, I'm actually going to refer to as Nuna. Those are synonyms, and they both refer to a Precambrian supercontinent. Then Rodinia will show up here in the later part of the Precambrian, before we get into some of the supercontinents you may be more familiar with, like Gondwana and Pangaea. So I'll show you examples of, in the next few slides, how Antarctica fits into those different time frames. But the two periods I'm going to focus on are in the red. So why Antarctica? Again, there's lots of motivations to work in Antarctica. It's really exciting to be there. The geology is really fantastic. It's hugely varying in terms of age, as we just saw in the last slide. There's even modern volcanism going on now. But one of the things that motivates me is how Antarctica fits into the supercontinent puzzle. And these are two different global views of supercontinents at two different stages. One called Rodinia about 1 billion years ago, where you can see East Antarctica here. West Antarctica didn't exist at this time. It's geologically too young, but the East Antarctic part did. And the red star indicates the area that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And it was contiguous with what we now know as Australia and India and the western part of North America, which here is called Laurentia, referring to most of the continent we know today as North America plus Greenland over on the east. So we think that about 1 billion years ago, all of these supercontinent fragments, or sorry, all these continental fragments were gathered together as one supercontinent. Gondwana, you may be more familiar with. Here is Antarctica, also in orange, and the red star indicates the Transantarctic Mountains. And so it's a completely different configuration, but Antarctica has been in the supercontinent of Nuna almost 2 billion years ago, Rodinia about 1 billion years ago. Gondwana was in existence in around 500 million years ago, and then Pangaea about 250 million years ago. So what you can see from these two different examples here is that Antarctica occupies a very central position in these supercontinents. And so it seems if we want to understand them better, we should know something about the geology of Antarctica itself. When we try to come up with supercontinent reconstructions, the further back in time we go, the harder the time we have, because the evidence gets thinner and thinner. For relatively recent plate motions, meaning in the last 200 million years or so, it's pretty easy to use what you see here. This is, you can see the continents of North America, South America, Africa, and Europe here. The Atlantic Ocean has these different color bands on it, and each color band corresponds to ocean crust of the different age. So the youngest crust is forming right along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the red zone, and they get progressively older ocean crust, meaning seafloor spreading, has caused South America to separate from Africa and North America to separate from Africa and Europe. And the ocean has opened up or expanded as those continents have drifted apart. So we can use the seafloor magnetic stripes that you see here to reconstruct the puzzle of how these continents have separated from one another. We can't really do that for times older than 200 million years because we don't have seafloor of that age. And so we have to turn to other kinds of evidence. So this again is just another proposed reconstruction for the supercontinent Rodinia about 1 billion years ago. And what we see is that here, East Antarctica, here the blue part all represents East Gondwana, but that is adjacent to North America here. And to make these kinds of reconstructions, we rely on geological correlation of rock types or mountain belt geology. We rely on paleontology and paleomagnetism, which is the study of how the Earth's magnetic field has changed over time and has been sampled by the rocks as they move around on the Earth. So we put all those different data sets together, and we can try to piece together where the supercontinents were and what they look like through time. But as I've tried to indicate here with the faded out text in the bottom, the deeper we go into time, the less certain we are about what the supercontinents look like. So we'll start with a relative level of certainty with the supercontinent Gondwana. In and about 500 million years ago, you can see here's East Antarctica, Australia, India, parts of Africa and South America. So this is the greater Gondwana supercontinent. And separating from it, in the earlier version of Rodinia, is North America, shown here in yellow. And as North America pulls away from Antarctica and Australia, you can see ocean circulation starts to come in. And also notice that the Transantarctic Mountains here are just about on the equator at that time. And so what we see is that there is this, and you may be familiar with this major explosion of life forms in the Cambrian. And so we have a couple of examples of Cambrian trilobites here that come from either East Gondwana or from North America, two different forms. And that suggests that maybe, partly, there may be a connection between tectonics, ocean circulation, warm temperatures, and the sort of diversification of these living forms at that time. So Antarctica, again, is central to that part of the puzzle of supercontinents. By Pangea time, between about 300 and 175 million years ago, this is a particular reconstruction is for about 200 million years ago. But in that time frame, you can see Antarctica is in this sort of peach color down here, and the Transantarctic Mountains shown again by the red star. And at this point, Antarctica turns out to be at a relatively high latitude, so probably at least 60 degrees south. And maybe there's a linkage here between the supercontinent fragmentation. We know that there are some mass extinctions that go on right about during this time period. Early on in Gondwana time, there are a lot of shared life forms like Glossopteris fossils that people like Alfred Wegener and others made famous in terms of reconstructing how plant species could coexist across many of these what are now separated but once neighbors in Gondwana. And Glossopteris can be found beautifully preserved in the Transantarctic Mountains of Antarctica. Okay, so that hopefully sets sort of the context. This is a geologic map of the Transantarctic Mountains. It's now turned sideways, so I have to apologize. When we're looking at Antarctica, we use all kinds of different points of view where basically there is no such thing as north to any one place that you happen to be. So in this particular case, we've just laid it on its side so we can see along the length of the mountain belt. We're going to focus on some rocks shown in purple down here at the bottom of this scale. So oldest rocks at the bottom of the scale, and they're shown in this central region of the central Transantarctic Mountains, which I put a red box around. That's where I've spent most of my research time. And that's going to tell us something about the ancient crust of East Antarctica that's exposed in a little window through the snow here. And then we're going to move up in time into the Cambrian, mostly Cambrian Ordovician, and talk about both sedimentary and igneous and deformational processes associated with the sort of underpinnings of the modern Transantarctic Mountains in the Ross orogenic belt. Okay, so before I go any further, I just want to say that a lot of the things I'll be talking about tonight are covered in a recent review paper that I wrote for Gondwana Research. And that's the same title as the talk I gave to the society tonight. If anybody's interested, I can provide an electronic copy of that if you just send me an email to the address that you see there. I also want to acknowledge that even though I'm the only one listed on this paper and on this talk, I've had many, many collaborators over the years, dozens literally, and they come from a variety of institutions in the US and overseas. The institutions are listed here. You can see one of my more recent field parties down in the picture down below. But lots of collaborators, lots of students that have participated in this research. And so it's very much a team effort all the way along. Okay, so it's a real pleasure and a joy to be able to go to Antarctica and to work there, but there are some difficulties challenges that you face getting there. This is a shot looking up from the ice shelf or near the ice shelf up toward a mountain peak called Mount Wade, which is a little over 12,000 feet. So you can see the dramatic relief in this area. It's actively being glaciated, and so we have a lot of difficulty getting in and getting around. So how do we do that? We use a variety of aircraft. You can see these cargo planes like this LC-130 Hercules. It's a military transport plane, but notice it has skis on the bottom of it so it can land on ice and snow. We use these Twin Otters in the upper left, lots of helicopters of different styles and airframes that are used to get us into different places. And then once we're in the field, usually by some kind of aircraft, then we just use snowmobiles and sleds. These are called Nansen sleds in honor of the Norwegian Nansen explorer that invented them or developed them, perfected them. Another aspect of working in Antarctica is just the challenge of being there. So I just listed a few of the extreme conditions that we face there. It's obviously very remote, and so it takes a lot of effort to get there, and you're also far away from, say, medical help of any kind. It's cold and extremely dry. It's a polar desert. We have katabatic winds, which just are basically density winds that flow down off the plateau. In the lower right, you see a picture of two people sampling some rocks there, and it doesn't really look like it maybe, but the wind is just a steady blow of about 35 miles an hour here, and with the temperature of about minus 70, the wind chill on that day was about a minus 105. So it's pretty extreme at certain times, but it can be very nice. We still have to worry about getting around safely. And one of the challenges, even though it's a desert, it may snow, and then you have difficulty seeing where you're going. And what you don't want to get into is a crevasse field where you may run into trouble there. In terms of approaches, we do a lot of traditional outcrop geology. One of the great things about Antarctica is once you get to the rocks, it's really great because there's no vegetation, there's no lichens, there's no private property. You can just go wherever you want and you can get onto the rocks and very well exposed. So we do a lot of outcrop geology. We've also been involved in some airborne geophysics projects for magnetics and gravity, essentially a way to see through the ice to see the rocks below. And then we use things like glacial deposits and sedimentary rocks you see on the lower part here, which I call geological proxies because I'm not a glacial geologist and I'm not a sedimentary geologist, but I use those materials to help me understand the evolution of the crustal rocks that they help expose. So we look at outcrop geology, again, beautiful exposure, and once you're on the rocks, things are looking pretty good. We set up tent camps usually of various kinds that gives us our supply of water. And again, once we're on the rocks, they're often a little bit warmer, and as long as the wind's not blowing too badly, it's a pretty pleasant place to work. So we're going to start out on the geology tour here to look at the Precambrian Craton, and this is a view looking across the mountain range up the Nimrod Glacier. And the mountains that you see in the background are part of what's called the Geologists Range. That's very fitting. And beyond that, on the horizon, is the polar ice cap. So that's the rest of Antarctica in the far distance there. What does this ancient craton look like? Well, where it's exposed through the ice, we see these very complicated gneisses and mixture of metamorphic and igneous rocks. As I'll show you, these range from a little over 3 billion years to about 1.7 billion years. And we do a lot of mapping and documenting the field relationships that we see. We also do a lot of sample collecting. And so a lot of the work to understand what's going on geologically is bringing the samples home to analyze. So as I say here in the bottom, to unravel this complexity, we need some small things and we need some big things. And so the small things are the mineral zircon. These are isolated grains that we've extracted from those rocks that I was just showing you. And we mount them in epoxy so that we can see them under the microscope, or in instruments that we image using electrons and other ion beams. So there are three different views of what I think you can tell is the same mineral grain of zircon. There's transmitted light, just straight up light in the microscope view to the upper left. If we cross the polarizers, we get this beautiful rainbow effect of colors, what we call birefringence on the upper right. And so we use that to study the overall structure and identify the properties of the mineral. But zircon is a zirconium silicate that is very abundant in lots of rocks. It is quite durable mechanically and chemically, so it holds up to erosion and chemical weathering very well, and it's preserved in a lot of different kinds of rocks. It's a zirconium silicate, but it has enough room in its lattice to take up radioactive elements like uranium and thorium. And we're going to talk about mainly uranium tonight, but the uranium, trace amounts of uranium in these zircons decays eventually to lead, and we can use that as a dating tool. So I'm going to talk about the image in the bottom in just a second, but we can use the uranium to lead decay process that takes place inside these zircons as a clock that we can use to date the age of the mineral and therefore maybe the age of the rock. So in this case, very highly simplified here, the radioactive decay process we're talking about goes from a parent isotope to a daughter isotope through natural decay. And there are two isotopes of interest here. Uranium-238 decays eventually to a stable mass of lead in the form 206, which, and the asterisk here means that it's the radiogenic or daughter product of that decay process. Uranium-235, which is also uranium, but a slightly different mass, decays eventually to lead-207. And so we have two independent internal clocks, basically, inside these zircon crystals that we can use if we can measure in detail all of these different isotopes that we have in the zircons themselves. So this is what's called a cathodoluminescence image. If you shoot the zircon with electrons, you end up with this kind of response. And then we can use an instrument that I'll show you in the next slide to determine the ages in little, very small spots. These are 20 microns in size. A micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. And so these are very tiny spot sizes that we can use to measure the isotopes in different parts of the zircon crystal. And then we can date different growth events that we see preserved here. So the something big part that we need is this instrument called a sensitive high resolution ion microprobe. It's kind of an oxymoron because the acronym for this whole long name here is SHRIMP. And shrimp sounds like it should be small, but shrimp is actually pretty large. You can see it basically fills a laboratory room in the photo in the bottom. And I'll be happy to answer questions if anybody has any about this in more detail later. But to talk about it quickly here, it's a type of mass spectrometer. We have a sample chamber over on the right-hand end of this instrument. And then there is basically an ion gun in the upper part of this, and you can see that diagrammed over here in the upper left. And that source of ions, in this case oxygen, a stream of oxygen comes down and it can be focused right on these very tiny spots on the zircon. And that liberates the uranium and the lead and even thorium out of those zircons. And then they get pulled by vacuum down this long flight path down through the rest of the boxes that you see here, following this sort of red path that you see outlined in the upper left-hand diagram. Eventually, those ions of uranium and lead end up at detectors on the far end, and they go through a magnet here. And so because each of those ions of uranium lead have different masses, the magnet, very sensitive to their masses, can turn them as they're flying down this tube, basically, and we can separate them. That's the spectrometer part of this term, mass spectrometer. And so if we can measure very precisely down here at the detector end the abundance of the different isotopes, then we can calculate an age for those zircons, assuming the decay rate or the half-life of those systems. So how do we do that in Antarctica? I'm going to show you a series of example rock types here, and to show you what this, how this works. Here's a very complicated gneissic rock that we see. There's a hammer for scale. Here are on the right are some of the zircons that we've extracted from that sample, to just 4 of them here. And you can see all the little spots on here. And I'm not going to go through the details of this, but basically the spot ages here are listed in these 4-digit numbers. So this is like 3091 is 3,091 million years. We translate that into 3 billion years, or 3.09 billion years. So every one of these zircon spots here is giving us an age of around 3 billion years old. And the average age of about 30 odd of these analyses is at 3087 million years, or 3.087 or 3.01, or sorry, 3.09 billion years. Okay, so we switch back and forth between millions and billions, depending on what we're trying to convey. So basically, we can learn the age at which this rock may have formed, and this spot technique here is really excellent for igneous and metamorphic rocks that may have suffered different stages in their evolution, and we can kind of pick them apart, because you can see that the zircons here themselves are quite complex. They have different growth domains in them, and we can analyze and pick apart every different part of that as we go along. Here's another example of these old Precambrian rocks. This is a gray gneiss labeled G here, and the zircons from that gneiss again are about 3 billion years old, but they're cut by a pink gneiss that is interpreted as an igneous unit, and it has an age of 2.8 or about 2.9 billion years here. And that confirms, we would expect it would be younger, and in fact it is, but it tells us that all of these events are going on around 3 billion years ago. Whoops, there we go. So then there's a big rock unit here. It's a granite, basically, that I've outlined by the white lines. Again, a different type of zircon response that we see over here, but again, we're able to date every one of the spots that you see labeled here. And even though some of the spots here are quite old, like at 2900 or 2862, again, those are in millions of years, there are some 1.7 billion year outer domains, and even some internal growth domains here. So this looks like basically a 1.7 billion year old granite that has some older components in it, inherited maybe from the other gneisses in the area. We have another gneissic rock here, again, just to illustrate that there's lots of different ages coming through here. These rocks formed about 2.5 billion years ago originally. And then we have this what we call a gneissic here, an orthogneiss formed from an igneous parent. The chapstick here for scale, and you can see that the zircons here give younger ages of around 1700 million years, or what we would also call 1.7 billion years old. Okay, so we have everything from 3 billion to 1.7 billion, and that history can be summed up in this stratigraphic diagram here. So this is a time diagram with time getting younger as we go up toward the top. But back in the Precambrian, between about a little over 3 billion years here, and between 1500 and 2000 million years here, we have a series of events. And so just again, representative, about 3.1 billion years, 2.5 billion years, and 1.7 billion years, okay? And so all these different ages of events tell us that there's a complex history, and that this represents the old Precambrian Craton of East Antarctica here, right? We'll talk about some of these younger events that are taking place up in the late Precambrian and the Paleozoic very shortly, so I'll save those for then. But in the meantime, another thing that we've been doing is looking at glacial erosion and seeing if the glaciers are transporting materials that we can use to understand something about the age of the Craton below. And so we have here on the map view that you see here is what Antarctica would look like if you stripped away all the ice. So we're looking at what's called subglacial topography here, and you can see there's a big mountain massif back up in here in these dark orange and brown colors. This is actually not exposed above the ice cap, but so it's all in the subsurface. There's some deeper basins here shown in the blue colors, and then the Transantarctic Mountains, which do poke up through the ice are shown along this strip here. And so the rock samples that I was just talking about come from the pink regions. You can probably barely see, just very tiny little windows through the ice into those old Precambrian basement rocks. But there are a bunch of glacial deposits along the edge of the mountains here, shown like this one up in the picture near Bird Glacier. And you can see all these rocks strewn in the ice here, and these big streams of channels of ice, basically, that indicate the glacial flow. And we're able to sample these igneous rocks, which have come from upstream, and they've come from an area somewhere in this white odd-shaped area here. This is this is what we think is the source for these kinds of bouldery types of glacial deposits that are coming through. So we've been able to sample a lot of those, and the point here is not to go through the details, but to show you that these are all kind of like cantaloupe to basketball-sized blocks, and you can see they're rounded mostly from glacial erosion. They all have different ages, again, in billions of years, about 2 billion years here, and about 1.2 billion years here, and just about everything in between. And so we've analyzed a lot of those rocks, and if we stack those up in an age diagram, so this is age on the bottom going from 3.2 billion years up to about 400 million years here. The purple bars show you the ages of the exposed basement that we were able to date before. So again, 3.1, 2.5, and 1.7 billion years. And then this magenta colored histogram or spectrum here shows you the ages of all those glacial deposit source rocks, which tells us that there's a whole different type of igneous crust out there in East Antarctica that we don't see exposed anywhere. This is all new real estate, if you will, new ages of geology that must be under the ice that's been carried out by glacial erosion, and then shows us from there what else is underneath the ice. Okay, so how does this relate to supercontinents? Well, we think that a lot, this is now you can see Australia, East Antarctica, and here's North America, what we call Laurentia. You can see the Great Lakes highlighted here. The black on here is the mid-continent rift geology, including the Duluth complex. And what we see is that there's a lot of geologic ties. This gets back to this idea of how do we reconstruct supercontinents. So back about 1 billion years ago, when Rodinia formed, and even in an earlier period, including the supercontinent Nuna, which may have existed as early as about 2 billion years ago, there seems to be a pretty robust connection between all of these three pieces. And so Antarctica, again, plays a very strong, prominent role in the ability to link these different continental fragments together in one larger mass. And that comes through from studying the Precambrian basement. Okay, now we're going to move to younger history, substantially younger history. And this is, again, kind of a complicated looking diagram, but it's actually pretty simple in overall aspect. We're looking at the transition between this older Precambrian supercontinent assembly to the younger supercontinent of Gondwana, which again forms mainly or is stable around 500 million years ago. So here you can see East Antarctica, Australia, and India over on the left. And here's Laurentia, along with various pieces of Africa, what will become Africa, and South America. Here's Kalahari, Congo, and so on. All of this stuff is gathering together and converging on one another in what we call West Gondwana and colliding across here, whereas East Gondwana, which includes these three pieces, is rifting away and separating to break this supercontinent up. And as it sort of pivots around this way, what happens is we form some very large mountain belts over here on this, in this region, which is yet to form. And we also start to form a subducting boundary over along the margin of Gondwana here. So this is the breakup process. And then by the time that Gondwana is sort of extant, when we think that most of the pieces have amalgamated into one larger whole, You can see here's a reconstruction of Gondwana on the inset. And then this diagram down here is nice because it shows that the Ross origin, that part in Antarctica that's all part of this larger Gondwana assemblage, is sort of rimmed or flanked by an ocean out here, which is to the south in the gray, which is subducting beneath the continental margin of what will become Australia, Antarctica, and even over into South America here in what is present-day Argentina. And so this is a convergent or subducting margin, kind of like the modern Andes. And it was active for a pretty long time during an episode of mountain building we call the Ross origin. So an orogeny is a mountain building event, and the Ross origin is the mountain belt itself. And at the base, or the sort of, maybe the basement of the Transantarctic Mountains, is this older mountain belt, the Ross origin. And you see it very dramatically exposed here. There's about 1,500 meters of relief on this cliff face here. This is a large glacier down at the bottom. So this is a big face. And what we see here are Cambrian carbonates that are thrust up over some actually younger Cambrian sandstones and shales in the gray and brown colored rocks here. So this is a large alpine type structure that indicates a lot of convergence and thickening at this time. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the major elements that represent this younger Ross orogeny or Ross origin period, and that's again shown in the central part of the Transantarctic Mountains where I've spent most of my work. So we're looking at some sedimentary, volcanic, and igneous rocks shown on this map. I put this slide in because this was a compilation for the paper that I wrote, and shows a lot of the different histories that many people have contributed to in looking at different sectors. So this is a time diagram going from older to younger, from the late Precambrian, here called the Cryogenian and Ediacaran, up into the Cambrian Ordovician, and for about, 6 different areas along the Transantarctic Mountains here. So a lot of different events have taken place, and we can see there are igneous events, sedimentary events, and so on. What we can take away from this kind of summary diagrams or synopsis diagrams gives us the ability to track changing events over time to see do they start at different times in different places, and can we reconstruct different aspects of the geology overall. So I'm not going to go into the details of that, but really just to show you some of the geologic highlights of this orogenic period. So what we have here is a series of cross-sectional views, tectonic cartoons, if you will, going from older at the top to younger at the bottom. And we start out where East Antarctica, shown by purple, has a passive margin or an ocean-facing margin out here with deposition of late Precambrian sandstones and shales, the sort of gray wacky assemblage that you see right here in this picture. So these are rift margin or passive margin gray wackies that are accumulating on this pre-Ross origin margin. As soon as we start the subduction process shown in the second panel and all the others down below, the gray slab coming in that represents the crust of the subducting oceanic plate that we believe was subducting at this time. And you can see there are several effects of that. We have the beginnings of a large continental margin magmatic arc, like we would see in the Andes today, with both plutonic and roots and volcanic carapace up above. And you can see that shown in the photos here. This is a large batholith system here with lots of large granitic intrusions that we find in the modern Transantarctic Mountains exposed very nicely. That arc continues to move, shown by the red colors in all the succeeding diagrams, but it shifts progressively to the right, which we think indicates a shift in the position of the subduction zone along with it. And one of the first things that happens when we start developing this large mountain belt and the arc and the volcanic and magmatic arc associated with it is that we have a lot of deformation going on, like that big thrust belt picture that I showed you before. And we start to raise the roof up on this mountain belt system. And so we generate a lot of sediment from that. So all these yellow colors that you see in these lower two diagrams indicate a lot of clastic material, sandstones, conglomerates, and breccias, and so on, washing out from this orogenic belt into alluvial fans and shallow marine types of sediments. And so this is, these sediments are being deposited in response to the mountain building process. Okay, so important igneous and sedimentary events here. We see that in this margin, it's not only convergent like you see here with the green oceanic crust being subducted beneath the continental margin, but it was probably oblique. It wasn't coming straight on, but it was sort of sliding in at an angle. And we can reconstruct that by looking at the deformation we see in the shallow sedimentary rocks in this sort of region up in here. We see at deeper levels the deformation of the intrusive rocks and these sheared rocks that tell us that there's a lot of deformation in a deep-seated part of this system as well. So now we have the possibility through glacial erosion to be able to see different aspects of the orogenic belt at different stages and different levels. Another thing that people have been finding, we have some of it exposed in the area that I was talking about before, but there are a group of Italian scientists who've been studying eclogites in part of the Transantarctic Mountains. And eclogites are rocks that contain garnet and a green pyroxene that are what we define as the eclogite assemblage. We associate those with high pressure metamorphism. But in this particular example that this group has identified, they have the mineral coesite, which is a polymorph of quartz, but it only exists at very high pressures. And in fact, we can reconstruct that these rocks that are shown in the pictures here would have formed 60 or 70 kilometers below the Earth's surface, which is basically like the base of the modern Himalayan mountain range. So again, the Ross orogenic belt at this time would have been a very, very thick mountain belt. Looking at the sedimentary system here, we can use the zircons in sediments to tell us something about where they were being eroded from. And if we go, this is a series of age profiles where each sort of band across this diagram, going from older at the bottom to younger at the top, represents an age spectrum for sandstones that we've sampled of different ages in this orogen. And what you can see is that the older samples, we know they're stratigraphically or depositionally older. And when you look at thin sections of those rocks, they are compositionally mature. They have mostly quartz and feldspar in them, and they're rounded grains and so on. So they look like they have come from more longer distance travel. They have a very strong cratonic source in their age profile, and nothing young like the Ross age of the Ross Belt itself, which is shown by the orange color that you see here at around 500 million years. Okay, so they don't have any of those ages. And that means that these pre-Ross origin rocks are not seeing any of the orogenic belt signal itself. And that makes sense. We didn't know that at the time, though, because all these sediments, they don't have any fossils in them. They're just all sandstones, basically, that all look pretty much the same. And so we were able to differentiate these as quite a bit older sequence. And then there's a younger succession here that you can see is much more texturally and compositionally immature. It's got a lot of feldspar. The bright minerals here are micas. And they're very angular grains and fragmental sort of texture here. So we think that these sediments are coming right out of the orogenic belt, and in fact, they're dominated by young ages that are in fact the age of the mountain belt itself. So we see these two different stages in the detrital mineral populations. And we can use that to reconstruct what we think the paleogeography was at this time. So I'm just going to focus on these three panels here. These are map views, and the Transantarctic Mountains today run sort of up and down along this region that you see here. And along the old rifted margin, we had deposition in these sort of patchy areas of rift margin sandstones that were being sourced from an exposed craton or shield area that you see over in the tan region to the left. Once we start the subduction process during the orogenic cycle, we start to see that the uplifting mountains and volcanic rocks that I've added now, shown by the pink triangles, are starting to erode and are contributing to deposition or depot centers in different places along the orogenic belt that you see now in the middle panel. And then finally, we see the more uplifted mountain belt shown in green. And this is again at 500 million years ago. This is not the modern belt. And it's washing and shedding lots of material out into the what we call the forearc region between the arc itself and the trench environment. So we see there's some significant stages in the depositional cycle here that are related to these processes. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears again and go jump ahead a little bit. So all of that deformation that we were just talking about, there are 500 million year old granites down here in the foreground. There are these Cambrian sandstones that we see in the dark brown color. They are overthrust by Cambrian limestones that are shown in these sort of gray colors in the mid-range. And then there's an unconformity following this line up in here with Devonian and younger sediments of the younger Pangea cycle sediments that we see across many of the continents in Africa and South America. Those types of sediments are shown above that unconformity on the skyline. If we look in more detail at those rocks, you can see here's a reconstruction of Pangea, again, down in the lower left of the, or lower right of this diagram. But here in the field, you can see there are some Devonian sandstones. These represent the beginning stages of deposition on the stable Antarctica after all of that Ross origin had sort of died off and subsided. It had been planed off, and now we're seeing Devonian sandstones, big four sets here of Aeolian sands. And then in the background are Triassic sediments with Jurassic sills, igneous sills intruding them in the back. Okay, so that's all part of the Pangea stage in development. Okay, the last thing I want to wrap up with tonight are why are these mountains even here today? So just keep in mind that I've gone through a lot of ancient history, back 3 billion years ago, 500 million years ago, and even into the Paleozoic. But the mountain belts still exist today, and they're still active, and there, as I said before, there are even active volcanoes in the range as well. This is a physiographic map taken from satellite radar data that shows you the very dramatic expression of the mountains themselves. The polar ice cap is over here to the left, and the Ross ice shelf floating on the Ross Sea is shown in the smooth surface over in the upper right. If we take a topographic profile along the white line that you see here from G to G prime, it looks like this profile that you see here. And I just want you to appreciate that this is the polar ice cap here. It rises up quickly to the mountain crest and then falls off all the way down to just about sea level here at the out on the ice shelf. And so the total relief here from sea level to the crest of the range is almost 12,000 feet. That's really dramatic. And so that's about, or on the meter scale here, that's almost 3.5 kilometers. If we add the depth of marine basins that sit out here that you can't see in this view, but if we add the depths of those marine basins, the actual structural displacement or total relief from the crest of the range down to the bottom of the basins is about 14 kilometers. So that's a huge, big drop here. And so we have a lot of questions about what causes this very dramatic relief. On this slide, you can see this is a cross-section through the Transantarctic Mountains, and you can see this one band of brown rocks here is kind of offset structurally, progressively stair-stepped down toward the Ross ice shelf here on the right, or sorry, on the left of this diagram. And what we see is that in the mountains themselves, there's like 5 kilometers of uplift that has taken place. And so what we can also do through some low temperature geochronology is figure out what the different uplift and exhumation stages are. And so during time, if on this plot on the lower right, we can see there was a major period of Cretaceous uplift, also in the late Cretaceous, and then there's been some ongoing Cenozoic uplift up until almost about 20 million years ago, most prominently, and that is what expresses the modern range today. So we don't really know. We don't have any good answers for what causes this young uplift, which is ironic because that's the most youthful part of the range. There are different ideas having to do with how Antarctica could be splitting apart through some sort of rifting process and actually flex or cantilever up the old Craton and bring it up in this tilted configuration that you see in the upper part of the diagram here. It might be that it's held up because of this rifting by some warm mantle from below that is buoyant and is holding it up, and what we call a dynamic support. So it's actually actively raising up those mountains. And it may be that there was an older mountain building plateau that has since collapsed, but left part of it high standing and sort of stranded up here as in a high elevation. So there are lots of different ideas, but those are some of the more prominent ones that people are still continuing to study today. So that in reference to my title, that's on the interesting enigma of the most youthful part of the story. Okay, so there's still some things just to finish up. There's still some things we want to know. We'd like to better understand variations in the space, time, and processes that are going on. So it's like that proverbial blind man looking at the elephant, you know, the different parts of the elephant and not seeing the whole thing. We have that problem a lot in Antarctica because we don't see all of the geology that's going on, and so we have to piece it together in different ways. It would be good to have better paleogeographic control and actually get some better data to constrain these supercontinent stages in development. We'd like to understand better the uplift and extension history that I just alluded to. It's not something that I do, but there are a lot of people actively working on that and what that tells us about the current state of tectonics in Antarctica. And then finally, I'm interested, as you've already seen, in understanding what the ancient continent looks like on the interior. It's unfortunately covered by the world's largest ice cap, and so we have to find new ways to be able to explore beneath that ice sheet. So with those kinds of questions, and I know it's been sort of a whirlwind tour, but I'll leave you with this other image looking across the Transantarctic Mountains, and be happy to, I can either stop sharing at this point or leave it up, but either way, I'm be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Well, why don't you leave the picture up? It's a nice one.
Okay, sounds good.
I don't see any questions yet. I have a couple of fairly quick ones. The mass spectrometer you talked about, Shrimp 2, I assume that's not located in Antarctica.
No, that is a very expensive instrument. There are not that many of them around the world, actually. There's probably only about 20 of them in various places, but they were designed in the 1980s by a group of scientists and engineers at Australian National University in Canberra, and they started selling them eventually, and now they're made commercially, but those are designed and made mainly in Australia, although I think they're starting to make them in China now, of all places. So.
Okay, and kind of related to that, how long from when you collect the sample do you get a chance to analyze it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two parts to that question. One is just literally getting the samples home. So what happens in the US program anyway, is that we typically box up our samples in wooden crates and then put them on a ship that comes down to resupply the Antarctic stations every year, and then it takes away what we call retro cargo. And so our rocks then take a ship from Antarctica back to a naval port in Southern California, and then from there they get brought to us by truck. So that whole process can take 4 or 5 months, and so it takes that long just to get the samples home. Between when we get the samples and when we have to start processing them, we have to first study them by making, putting them on the making slices of thin sections so we can put them on the microscope. We want to, then the age dating work is pretty expensive, and so we only want to do that on the samples that we have the best questions to ask. And so that takes months of study, and then we have to crush the rocks to get those zircons out of there. That can take more months, and then analyze them. So it can be, probably about the fastest we could do that kind of work would be maybe about a year, but it often takes a couple of years to start getting good results.
Okay, I have one more question, and I see Alan and Kay have the same question. When you take a trip to Antarctica, how long are you there at one time?
Typically around 2 months, maybe 3 months would be a typical field season. I just got off the ice in February, and I left in late November. So I guess all told, I was there for about 2.5 months this year, or this last season. But it depends on where you're going and what the logistics are like. Unfortunately, I showed you all those different kinds of aircraft. You can get held up by weather. I haven't really shown you the bad weather situations. I mean, it does, the wind does blow and stuff like that, but you can really get caught in some foul weather, and then the aircraft don't fly very often. So it depends. I mean, I've been stranded as much as just 2 weeks waiting for a plane to come pick us up, and so it can take a while for things to happen. But I would say 2 or 3 months is a typical field season. That includes a lot of travel time and just setup and that sort of thing. So maybe in the end, half of that time is actually doing field work.
Okay, and I can't remember what I was going to ask. Real quick before another question. Somebody was interested in continuing education credits, and I haven't seen any requests for it yet. So if you want that, get it in there in the next couple of minutes into the chat. Question from Mike: what is the present seismicity of the Transantarctic mountain area?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not much. Unfortunately, we don't have permanent seismometers in place. There have been a number of arrays that have been put in over short periods of time, meaning a few years at a time before they get taken out again. And so we don't have a lot of data. And I don't have a slide to show you what the active seismicity is, but along the Transantarctic Mountains, it's not much. So there's not a lot of youthful activity related to that whole boundary that I was referring to, which is another curiosity. There have been some seismic profiles run across there in order to image what the crust and the lithosphere and the mantle are doing. But in terms of actual earthquake seismicity, it's not like, for instance, if you're a sort of an analogy or an analogous place that people often think about is the Wasatch Front in Utah, outside Salt Lake City and running up into Idaho. And that's, of course, very seismically active. And this isn't anything like that. It's much, much quieter.
Okay, thank you. Remember the other question I was going to ask concerning travel. Do you travel through South America to get there?
I don't, but for the US program, scientists, there are basically 2 avenues, and one does go through South America. You would fly commercial airlines down to Punta Arenas, and then you would get on a vessel there typically and fly over the Drake Passage to get to the Antarctic Peninsula, if that's where your work takes you. There are also people, there are some rare flights that cross there as well, but mostly they go by vessel or ship. And so but the vast majority of people going to the US program, meaning to the areas that I've just talked about, or to South Pole Station where there's a permanent base, we fly commercial airline down to New Zealand. We get to Christchurch on the South Island, and then from there it's military flights or military supported flights from Christchurch down to McMurdo. And once we're in McMurdo Station, then you get sort of set out from there, depending on where you're trying to get and go in different directions. So we go in typically by flying down to New Zealand and then beyond from there.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Question from Mark, and I think you've kind of answered it, but analyzing the tiny rock specks, did you somehow bring them from the field or bring bigger rocks and chip them?
Yeah, so we, that's a great question. We, depending on the kind of method that we anticipate using, we can get away with something, you know, like a couple of kilograms of a rock. So that would be like the size of a small, maybe a half a bread loaf or something like that. We can do a lot with a piece of rock that big. But other times we take bigger samples because it's helpful just to have the extra material. But we basically, the easiest way to get to the point where we have minerals that we can analyze, as I showed you tonight, is to take at least part of that sample, that rock sample, and break it up into small bits and then crush it. And then what we're trying to do is to disaggregate it so that we have all the minerals separated from one another. So we can either physically crush it up, literally put it in a crusher and break it up into its pieces. And then we have different physical methods using the magnetic properties or the density properties or just the physical properties of shaking them down, kind of like mineral processing. It's very, you know, similar sort of applications here. And we do these different kinds of things to separate the minerals, you know, one from the other. So we get a pile of, in this case, zircon. It's a very small pile, but we get a pile of zircon in the end. And so we can either actually crush the samples up, but then there's some people that are, over the past decade or so, have been starting to do something called a electropulse disaggregation, where they basically zap the rock and a very intensive high voltage electrical charges follow the grain boundaries and then split the minerals apart from one another. It's not enough to break a mineral and break the bonds that hold the mineral together, but it's enough to separate minerals one from the other, or mineral grains. And so either way, we end up with it's a sort of a tedious process, and you have to be careful and you have to be clean, because whatever equipment you use to do this aggregation, you have to thoroughly clean that equipment before you put the next sample in, because you don't want to cross-contaminate samples and things like that. So it's a very time-consuming, laborious, and you have to just be careful. You have to watch what you're doing and make sure you don't lose anything or contaminate a future sample.
And all that crushing is done after you get home, I assume.
Right, yeah. So there used to be some basic geology lab in that McMurdo station, and it had some rock saws, it had some equipment to make thin sections, and it had microscopes, things like that. And then even had there was an X-ray fluorescence machine there to do chemical analyses. It's so expensive to keep that equipment running. And, you know, and in contrast to biological samples, which can, you know, die or degrade, you know, nothing really happens to rocks. So it's just easier to ship everything home and do all that laboratory work at home. And a lot of what I do, I should emphasize, the work that I've done over the years, that's where a lot of these collaborators come in, because not everybody has all the lab facilities at their fingertips. So it's very, very helpful to be able to go take some samples to somebody else's lab and do some analyses in a different place. And we get a lot more mileage out of samples that way.
Okay. And then right now, just one more question, unless somebody gets another one in, and we will also open up the phone lines in a minute. From Patrick, are there different approaches to try to separate/eliminate the possibilities for modern uplift, or is that something where even the approach hasn't been broached?
I think I'm understanding the question to mean, are there things that we can yet do to understand how the modern uplift is taking place? Is that the essence of the question?
I think so.
Okay. Yes, the answer is yes. And a lot of that comes back to in particular different types of geophysics. So we use GPS as a modern technique in geodetic surveying, so we can figure out what that actual uplift is, and we have people have deployed what are called basically survey grade or geodetic grade GPS receivers out in the mountains, and they can track that kind of motion very precisely over time. There are people that do seismology or these sort of seismic experiments to try to image, and that's where this idea of warm mantle is maybe supporting the mountains from below. That actually comes from some seismic evidence for anomalously warm mantle beneath the mountains. But the problem is with that the data are not conclusive. The mountains are actually not any thicker in many respects than the rest of the crust in Antarctica or East Antarctica. So not everything is coming together. There are also some people doing some electrical resistivity studies, and a lot of these things are in the works, I guess. People have started doing them, but there is no single unequivocal answer that comes to mind. Hopefully, and the other problem is deploying these geophysical arrays is very logistics intensive. So you've got to put out a lot of instruments in the field and maintain them and keep them warm so that they can collect data and so on. It's a big technical and logistical challenge. So people are making inroads on that, but I just don't think we have enough information yet to be sure of what the answers to those questions are.
Okay, Patrick, I opened up your mic. Did you get your question answered?
Yes, and it sounds like a fascinating future and a reason to stay tuned.
Yeah, I think we'll continue to get new evidence. And this, again, not work that I do, so it's interesting to follow and see what other people are finding. But again, it takes a lot of coordinated effort and overcome technical challenges to be able to acquire the kinds of data that help us see into this problem that on the surface, we only get so much information from.
Okay, and then for phone line ending in 6271, I'm trying to unmute you if you have a question. And there's also a phone line 8631. If you, I think I'm trying, I don't hear anything from either of you, so I'm guessing.
Yes, I do have a question. This is Mary Helen. Obviously, I can't see the maps. I've been sitting here with a map in front of me. You were talking about getting data from the Ross Ice Shelf in terms of glacial deposits. Have you seen any evidence of glacial materials coming from the Transantarctic range all the way down to what looks like, what I'm thinking you're calling far eastern Antarctica, like Enderby Land and the Lambert Glacier? Have you seen any material coming down that far?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, we don't. And the reason is because in the middle of East Antarctica, think of that whole ice cap as a big lens or a big dome that is highest in the middle. And ice, because it's actually, it behaves like a plastic. And so it flows under its own weight, so to speak. So gravity basically is always pulling ice downhill. And you can imagine a glacier, or if anybody's able to see the picture on the screen, you can see how the ice is going to flow out of the high mountain areas down and into the lower valleys. And even on the ice cap, it spreads out very slowly, but it does spread out over time. And so way over on that area that you mentioned called Enderby Land, which is on the far, for me, the far side of Antarctica, that would be sort of due south from Africa region and or India. And because you have to cross this big ice cap or ice dome, the ice is basically spreading out in all directions. So there would be no way for ice to move from Enderby Land across the ice cap and end up on the other side in the Ross Ice Shelf. Does that make sense?
No, I meant the other direction. Are you seeing
Oh.
material from the mountains, from the Transantarctic Mountains,
Oh,
ending up in Endersby Land or the Lambert Glacier? Has it, given the amount of time involved, has it managed to make it that far east?
yeah. Okay. I see the question, but the answer is basically the same.
Okay.
There isn't a way for ice to go over the ice cap and then flow down into the Lambert Glacier area.
Okay.
If the ice is sort of spreading radially out from the middle, more or less, and it's kind of it's not quite circular pattern of the ice cap, but it's kind of elliptical. So it just kind of spreads out in all directions out toward the margins, and so the ice will we call it an accumulation zone in the middle of Antarctica. That's where the ice, the snow is precipitating and forms the ice, and then it spreads out from there. But it's interesting that you asked that question, because right about in the middle of Antarctica, there is this subglacial mountain range called the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. And if you might be able to, you won't see it on a conventional map because they don't poke up through the ice cap, but they're there. We know they're there from radar flown by airplanes going over that region. And so we know that there's a large mountain range under there. And one of the things we don't know is what kinds of rocks are there and why that mountain range is standing up as high as it is, even though it's still covered with ice. And so people have used exactly that kind of glacial flow because it's sort of in the middle. So some of the ice is eroding off that mountain range and moving over to the Lambert Glacier drainage, and some of it is moving down into the Byrd Glacier drainage and into the Ross Ice Shelf. And so we could do a comparison of the materials that are being sourced in both directions. Unfortunately, the kinds of things that we've done on the Byrd Glacier side going into the Ross Ice Shelf haven't been done by people that have access to the Lambert Glacier area. So it'd be an interesting thing to compare at some point.
Okay, I had one other question, might be a little easier, which is, what is the scariest thing that has happened to you on your trips out there?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of mishaps in airplanes and one in a helicopter, but fortunately not any, major injuries, but they scared me because I know things can happen. It's interesting. One of the seasons that we covered a lot of ground involved flying in those Twin Otter airplanes that I showed a picture of, and we had helicopters available at that time as well. But it was that very season that one of those planes was flying through these mountains, and it only had the pilot and co-pilot in it, but they ended up flying through cloud and just crashed right into the side of a mountain, and they were both killed. And so things like that happen. There was just a couple of years ago, there was a glaciologist, a person that studies moving ice from New England, and he somehow drove across a crevasse not too far from McMurdo and broke through and fell to the bottom, and he died at the bottom of a crevasse. So there are real dangers for people, and I've had some people that have had to leave our field parties because of frostbite issues, so we've had to medevac them out. So I think we've been lucky, but I worry about people that are in our field parties, because I know that sometimes bad things do happen, and we just try and be really aware of each other and be really safe. So that's, so far we've not had any major mishaps, but it's always possible.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And for 8631, I've been trying to unmute you, but so I'm guessing no questions there. That's the last of the questions. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's been my pleasure to share my experiences with you, and I hope some of the geology made sense. I know that's covering a lot of ground, but it is just a fascinating place, and there's so much to be able to see, and it is a spectacular area with lots of great exposure. So if anybody's been to Antarctica on a tour, that's great, and if you ever have an opportunity to go, that would be fantastic as well, because it is a marvelous continent to be able to get to and experience. It's like, it is literally a different world than anything that I think any of us have ever experienced before getting there. So I encourage you to try.
Okay. One follow-up question then. When do you expect to get back?
Well, we have an ongoing project to develop a new approach to seeing through the ice, and so we're still working on putting that together. I'm hoping that it'll be, right now, unfortunately, COVID has affected all the Antarctic programs, because the #1 goal of all international programs is to keep COVID out of Antarctica. And so there's going to be a backup, but I'm hoping that within 2 or 3 years that my field projects will be back on the ice, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. One last comment from Patrick. Thanks so much. Geology with extreme logistics.
Yeah. Yep.
So thank you, and I'll send you the link for the recording in the next few days when we get it. And thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you very much, Dave, for the invitation again, and it's been my pleasure. So I hope everybody has a good rest of the evening. Thank you so much for your interest.
Okay.